Welcome to this talk about Australia. I'm going to give you some key facts and figures about the country, which I hope you'll find of interest. First, let's start with geography. Where is Australia? Australia is in Oceania, between the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific Ocean. Australia is ranked as a continent. It's the smallest continent, having an area of 7.6 million square kilometers. Of that, 68,920 square kilometers is water, so in land area, Australia is slightly smaller than the U.S. In fact, Australia is the world's sixth largest country. As a very large island, Australia's climate is generally dry, that is, arid to semi-arid, temperate in the south and east, tropical in the north. The terrain, that's the type of land surface, is mostly low plateau with deserts, and fertile plain in the southeast. The lowest point in Australia is Lake Eyre at -15 meters. The highest point is Mount Kosciuszko, that's spelt Kosciuszko, at 2,229 meters. Australia is rich in natural resources. Among the chief are bauxite, coal, iron ore, copper, tin, silver, and nickel. You may have heard of the Australian gold rush, and some gold is still exported. We have several environmental issues here in Australia. The top one is soil erosion. The main reasons for soil erosion are firstly, overgrazing, secondly, industrial development, and thirdly, urbanization, the growth of cities. Another issue is the rising amount of salt in our soils. This comes from using poor quality water. Desertification, the growth of the desert, is another problem. In addition, clearing land for agricultural purposes threatens the natural habitat of many unique animal and plant species. Then also the Great Barrier Reef off the northeast coast, which is the largest coral reef in the world, is threatened by increased shipping and by its popularity as a tourist site. The second section of this talk is about Australia's population. We Australians are concentrated along the eastern and southeastern coasts. So how many Australians are there? Well, as of July 1997, there were an estimated 18.4 million. Of these, 66% were aged between 15 and 64 years. Life expectancy at birth is 79 years, 76 years for men and 82 for women. Now, I should tell you that the country of Australia is made up of 6 states and 2 territories. These are the Australian Capital Territory, New South Wales, the Northern Territory, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, and Western Australia. The national capital is Canberra. Right, let's turn to the Australian economy. Australia has a prosperous Western-style capitalist economy. Australia is a major exporter of agricultural products, minerals, metals, and fossil fuels. Commodity prices have a big impact on the economy. Australia suffered from the low growth and high unemployment typical of the OECD countries in the early 1990s, but the economy has expanded at reasonably steady rates in recent years. In addition to high unemployment, short-term economic problems include how to balance output and inflation and how to stimulate exports. The economy is made up like this: agriculture, 3.1%, industry, 27.7%, services, 69.2%. The labor force has a similar pattern. The total labor force is 8.2 million. 34% work in finance and services, 23% work in public and community services, 20% work in the wholesale and retail trade, 17% work in manufacturing and industry, and 6% work in agriculture. What are the chief industries of Australia? They are mining, industrial, and transport equipment, food processing, chemicals, and steel. What are Australia's main agricultural products? They are wheat, barley, sugarcane, fruit, cattle, sheep, and poultry. And who do we sell our products to? At present, our chief export market is Japan, which takes 24% of our exports. After that, South Korea takes 8%, and New Zealand and the U.S. each take 7%. In years to come, however, we expect China to become a significant trade partner. China already supplies 5% of Australia's imports. This is the same amount as New Zealand. Meanwhile, we take 1/5, in fact 22% of our imports from the U.S., 17% from Japan, and 6% from the U.K. So what sort of things does Australia import? Well, we import a lot of machinery and transport equipment, especially computers and office machines, also telecommunications equipment, and in addition we have to import oil and petroleum products. So let's move to the subject of communications in Australia. We have an estimated 8.7 million telephones and 9.2 million televisions. There are some 134 television broadcast stations and 325 radio stations. The related subject of transport is naturally very important in such a big country as Australia. Let's look at highways first. There are two kinds of highways, paved and unpaved. Paved highways are regular roads with a permanent surface. But actually, we have more unpaved highways, around 60%, than paved, when all the country roads are included. In addition, Australia has a railway network of over 38,000 kilometers. But you'll probably find it hard to believe how many airports we've got. 10? 20? 50? No, the total is 443. Of course, this includes many short runways on farms and in the outback. There are only 9 airports with runways of more than 3,000 meters.
Look, here's one that might interest you.
What is it? Are you sure? The last one you sent me off to was a disaster.
Yes, look. It says they want a junior sales manager, and it looks like it's a big international company. That'd be good. You might get to travel.
What kind of company is it, though?
Let's see. Yes, it's a textile company that seems to import from abroad. That's odd, isn't it? What else? They say the salary is really good. They operate a system of paying you a basic salary and then offering sales commission on top of that. They say it's high. And, oh, look, they give you a car to travel around in. Gosh, that's not bad, is it?
Do they say anything about experience?
Let's see. No. They want someone young with ambition and enthusiasm. Oh yes, they want graduates, so that's okay. You've been to university. Now what else? Let's see.
There must be some catch.
No, the only thing is you have to travel. But then that's what the company car's for. Oh, and you have to be able to get on well with other people, because it says you have to be good in a team.
Perhaps I'll have a closer look at that one. Now, could you tell us more about what you do in your department? I mean, what research are you actually doing at the moment?
We're trying to find out as much as we can about dreams. There's one area that we're particularly interested in at the moment, and that is what we call directed dreaming.
Directed dreaming? What is that exactly?
Let me explain. You know, sometimes, if you're having a dream and you wake up in the middle of it, you can sometimes go back to sleep again and go back to the dream.
Yes.
Well, that is similar to what we call directed dreaming. Now, what I was talking about is a fairly common experience, but real directed dreamers are people who have always complete control over what they dream because they actually know what they're dreaming.
They can dream what they want?
Yes, nearly.
Can anyone develop this ability?
Well, that's one of the things that we would like to find out. At our centre, we have in fact got 3 people who are very reliable and who can have these directed dreams quite regularly.
And what sort of experiments do you do with them?
Well, a few weeks ago, we thought it would be interesting to see if there was any way that these 3 regular dreamers could communicate with each other in a directed dream while they were sleeping. So one night, we arranged for them all to stay at the centre. Then we asked the 3 of them, there were 2 men and a woman, we asked them all to go to a pub that they all knew quite well, down by the river, and asked them if they started dreaming to go down there and try to find each other.
In the dream? Or 3 dreams?
Yes, so they all went off to sleep, and the next morning we interviewed them all separately and asked them what they had seen. The 2 men had had dreams and could remember them, and they both said that they had been to the pub and had seen each other and had had a talk. But also, both of them said that they hadn't seen the woman, and we thought that was a bit odd. And then we talked to her, and she told us that she hadn't had a dream at all that night, or she couldn't remember it anyway.
Fascinating. So both of the men said she hadn't appeared in their dreams, and that was because she hadn't in fact been dreaming.
Yes, though of course it could just be a coincidence, but that's the kind of thing that we're trying to find out more about.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Border. It's been fascinating talking to you.
Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome to this month's Observatory Club lecture. I'm Donald Mackey, and I'm here to talk to you about the solar eclipse in history. 1,000 years ago, a total eclipse of the sun was a terrifying religious experience. But these days, an eclipse is more likely to be viewed as a tourist attraction than as a scientific or spiritual event. People will travel literally miles to be in the right place at the right time to get the best view of their eclipse. Well, what exactly causes a solar eclipse? When the world goes dark for a few minutes in the middle of the day. Scientifically speaking, the dark spot itself is easy to explain. It is the shadow of the moon streaking across the earth. This happens every year or 2, each time along a different and, to all intents and purposes, a seemingly random piece of the globe. In the past, people often interpreted an eclipse as a danger signal heralding disaster, and in fact, the Chinese were so disturbed by these events that they included among their gods one whose job was to prevent eclipses. But whether or not you are superstitious, or take a purely scientific view, our earthly eclipses are special in 3 ways. Firstly, there can be no doubt that they are very beautiful. It's as if a deep blue curtain had fallen over the daytime sky as the sun becomes a black void surrounded by the glow of its outer atmosphere. But beyond this, total eclipses possess a second, more compelling beauty in the eyes of us scientists, for they offer a unique opportunity for research. Only during an eclipse can we study the corona and other dim things that are normally lost in the sun's glare. And thirdly, they are rare. Even though an eclipse of the sun occurs somewhere on Earth every year or 2, if you sit in your garden and wait, it will take 375 years on average for one to come to you. If the moon were any larger, eclipses would become a monthly bore. If it were smaller, they simply would not be possible. The ancient Babylonian priests, who spent a fair bit of time staring at the sky, had already noted that there was an 18-year pattern in their recurrence, but they didn't have the mathematics to predict an eclipse accurately. It was Edmund Halley, the English astronomer, who knew his maths well enough to predict the return of the comet, which incidentally bears his name, and in 1715 he became the first person to make an accurate eclipse prediction. This brought eclipses firmly into the scientific domain, and they have since allowed a number of important scientific discoveries to be made. For instance, in the eclipse of 1868, two scientists, Janssen and Lockyer, were observing the sun's atmosphere, and it was these observations that ultimately led to the discovery of a new element. They named the element helium after the Greek god of the sun. This was a major find because helium turned out to be the most common element in the universe after hydrogen. Another great triumph involved mercury. I'll just put that up on the board for you now. See, there's Mercury, the planet closest to the sun. Then there's Venus, Earth, etc. For centuries, scientists had been unable to understand why Mercury appeared to rotate faster than it should. Some astronomers suggested that there might be an undiscovered planet causing this unusual orbit, and even gave it the name Vulcan. During the eclipse of 1878, an American astronomer, James Watson, thought he had spotted this so-called lost planet. But alas for him, he was later obliged to admit that he had been wrong about Vulcan and withdrew his claim. Then Albert Einstein came on the scene. Einstein suggested that rather than being wrong about the number of planets, astronomers were actually wrong about gravity. Einstein's theory of relativity, for which he is so famous, disagreed with Newton's law of gravity in just the right way to explain Mercury's odd orbit. He also realized that a definitive test would be possible during the total eclipse of 1919, and this is indeed when his theory was finally proved correct. So there you have several examples of how eclipses have helped to increase our understanding of the universe. And now let's move on to social.
When the Europeans first came to the American continent more than 400 years ago, there were relatively few diseases and viruses on the new continent. During that time, however, plagues and diseases that killed thousands were floating around Europe. Eventually, some Europeans developed immunity to the unsanitary world of industrialization. When they came to the American continent, however, many of the Native Americans had never been exposed to these viruses and hence did not develop immunity to them. By sharing the same food and water sources, many Native Americans contracted the European diseases. At a time when medical vaccines were still in their early stages, this led to the tragic death of thousands. The Native Americans gradually developed immunity to these diseases and were able to interact with the new explorers and colonists. They traded everyday items with each other, which led to the hybridization of these two cultures. One enterprising European colonist had an interesting idea. Why not create a trading post where the two groups could sell their newly combined works of art? Eventually, a post was set up, and the distinctly American works became known throughout the country for their unique styles. The trading post continued for a couple more decades until it eventually faded away. The works of that time period can now be seen at the Smithsonian National Museum. Until very recently, some tribes were still making pieces of art and selling them in their local trading posts.